Hello and welcome to the inaugural Game Commission podcast. I'm Travis Lown, the Communications Director for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And with me today is Steve Smith. Steve is the Director of the Game Commission's Bureau of Information and Education. And also with us today is Wayne LaRush. Wayne, the Director of the Game Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management. So we have Wayne in here today to talk to us about anterless license allocations. You know, in Pennsylvania, deer management is done largely through the annual allocation of antlerless licenses and the harvest of antlerless deer. So we wanted Wayne to explain how that works, to tell us what might be on the horizon that's different from the way that we've done things in the past, and to explain that process and what hunters get out of it. So Wayne, please take it away.
Well, we're trying to manage Pennsylvania's deer population so that it's in balance with the forest resources out there. And that means that we need to issue antlerless allocations, permits, so that we can control the total number of deer on the landscape. Each year we take a look at how many bucks are harvested. And based on the buck harvest and ratios of does and fawns in our harvest and other data, we come up with a population estimate of deer, and that works its way into our recommendations coming out of our formulas for deer in the coming year.
Now, Wayne, our board and your staff just went through this process very recently. And I think what hunters want to know is what kind of changes can they expect to see based on allocation numbers from last year's hunting seasons to this year's hunting seasons?
Pretty much this year, the total number of permits will be similar to what it was last year. Some units, there'll be a few fewer permits in areas where we'd like to have the deer herd increase. And in some units, there'll be more permits where we are trying to stabilize or the deer numbers on the landscape.
Okay, but for the most part, we're looking at pretty consistent with what it was the previous season, would you say?
Very consistent. Most all the units across the state are right about where they were last year.
And how about another component to this being the length of the antlerless season?
Length of seasons really matter to us primarily that they don't change too much because we're managing based on trends. And as far as the buck harvest, our harvest trends are 3-year rolling averages. You know, we always average the previous 3 years, and we look at the trend of whether the population's increasing, decreasing, or staying stable. We also look at the forest habitat condition. We've got plots all around the state that our Division of Forest Habitat Management looks at. And on a 5-year rolling average, we're looking at whether or not regeneration of our forest is good, fair, or poor. And we're also looking at how severe the deer browsing is. Based on those factors, we then have a decision-making tree that we use to determine whether or not forest health is good enough to allow more deer on the landscape, or whether or not we should stabilize the deer, whether the population is going up and down, and whether or not hunters and other landowners want more deer. And this tree then provides us with a mechanism to determine whether we want to increase or decrease the numbers.
So those factors are more important from your perspective than the length of the season because they go into the allocation total. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, because if we have a shorter season and we want to take a certain number of deer, then obviously we'd have to issue more permits. If we have a longer season, then and to take the same number of deer, we may be able to issue fewer permits.
Were there any changes to the season lengths for this upcoming year from the previous year?
No changes. They remain the same this year as what they were last year.
Okay. And Travis alluded to it in the opening. There's talk of sort of changing the process, not so much the factors that go into the decision, but taking a longer period of time as opposed to on a year-to-year basis.
Correct. We're like I mentioned before, we're using 3 or 5 year rolling averages to either assess the changes in deer population or the forest health conditions. And so it may make more sense for us to maybe change our permit allocations every 3 years. That way we have a more consistent timeline. As everybody knows, you go out there on a nice sunny opening day, with a lot of hunters in the woods, and the harvest may be, really high. And with the same number of deer the following year, if you get a terrible weather, rainy, cold, windy weather on the first day, the harvest could be way down. And that opening day has a big impact on the total harvest. And so you may have artificially high or artificially low numbers. And so when those are averaged over 3 years, then it works its way out, and you don't have those, blips in the system that.
Yeah, those ups and downs. I think
Yeah.
temperature can be a big variable as well, because you mentioned
Absolutely.
that sunny opening day.
Mhm.
But if it's a warm sunny opening day, it's hard to get guys moving. It's
hard
pretty
to get
comfortable.
deer moving,
It's hard to
too.
get deer moving. Yeah,
It's-
yeah. Now we talked about allocations. We talked about season length. And I know our hunters want to know overall, what direction are we going with the population of deer in Pennsylvania? Are we keeping things stable? Are we increasing it? And it's hard to say that since we have so many management units, but what are we seeing on the ground based on the data your team's collecting?
As I mentioned before, it varies by wildlife management unit, but in general, across the whole state, we've been trying to keep things fairly stable. Forest is still recovering in many parts of the state from having a lot of deer historically. But in general, in the past 12 years, the buck harvest has been increasing slowly. So it does appear as if our deer population may be slowly trending upwards, and that's part of the reasons why you'll see perhaps some increases in allocations going forward at times.
And we certainly saw an increase in the buck harvest this year. And I think one variable that was pretty remarkable was the age of the buck being harvested, with
A lot of older bucks since we've had our antler restriction.
a lot of older bucks. Yeah.
And we actually, the deer harvest this past fall, I think, was the highest in the past 12 years.
That's right. And if memory serves, I think we were close to 50%, if not more. We're over 2.5.
I think it was
age.
60% or close to
60%.
60%.
So definitely we're harvesting some nice mature buck, which traditionally wasn't taking place.
Absolutely. I mean, I saw some beautiful bucks on my game cameras I had out there. I mean, I put game cameras out, and I had 13 different bucks on 2 cameras I left in the same location, and 4 of those bucks were nice bucks, and I think 11 out of 13 were legal.
Yeah, and I was just looking today at the employee photo spread that we had prepared for the July game news, and I was really astonished by the number of huge bucks that our employees took this year. And, I think that that's encouraging for the outlook of hunting statewide, that, maybe we are reaching the end of the there's no deer in the woods argument. I mean, certainly our hunters are bringing them in year after year.
And really, the habitat is the big issue. And, I went out and I hunted this past fall, and I tried to hunt in a number of different kinds of areas. And I can say, where there has been little forest management and the trees are 70 to 100 years old, there are not many deer, but then if you look closely, there's not much for the deer to eat. And so, that's an issue. On the other hand, where I hunted, where we've done active management on our game lands, and that's where I had these cameras. I mean, when you see 13 different bucks, 11 of them legal on the same camera on right near a clear cut, obviously there's some deer out there.
And ultimately, then the habitat will drive the allocation numbers. Is that a safe assessment? That
Absolutely. As those forest conditions improve, then and as long as people want more deer, hunters and the public want more deer, then we will gradually increase the number of deer on a landscape. That means decrease the number of permits allocated in order to increase the number of deer. But we have a decision-making tree that takes all these things into account, and we can change how the tree works, which we may do as we move into our next cycle of deer planting. But basically, we need to have a system so that we aren't going pillar to post. so that we actually use data from the field in order to make good decisions. Also, including taking into account what people want.
And as you talk about that decision tree and all the other factors and everything you look at, a big part of it is the harvest reports that we receive from our hunters. So why don't you talk on that issue, talk about the importance of getting those report cards and online reports from our hunters?
Absolutely. I mean, hunters need to understand that they are a major part of the management system for deer. Not only do they help us control the deer on the landscape, but they determine what we do on the landscape. And without the data that's provided by those harvest reports, then the knowledge base that we have in order to make sound decisions is eroded. And so it's critically important that people try to make sure they report the deer. This isn't about just law enforcement. This is about us knowing how many deer are in the harvest, and on a fine scale whether or not that harvest is increasing and decreasing in response to changes in the deer population.
Okay, I think that'll wrap us up for today. Wayne, thanks for your time. Steve, thanks for joining us. I'm Travis Lau, and thanks for joining our podcast.
Thanks for having us.